Thank you for that lovely introduction, Leslie and Omar. And now you all know the truth about Malcolm and us. So I'm going to be trying to move a little bit between what you see on the screen and what I see on my laptop screen. And given the state of technology, this could be a challenging thing, but we'll see. We'll see how we can go. So far, so good. My name is Jace Clayton, and I want to thank you guys for this offer to come share some thoughts in progress here. It's fantastic opportunity. And I know that everyone could very well easily be at home staring at social media, trying to find out what's going on in Iowa, what's going on in America, what's going on in the world. And instead you're here trying to find out what's going on with me. So I thank you for that pretty deeply. And tonight I'm going to talk about white noise, about bass in trap music, and about the strange, squelchy synthesizers of acid house. And always in relation to how sound is interacting with political spaces. And so I'd like to begin by just saying that, we're here in an art school, and there's this sense of we all know what contemporary art is, right? And there's some idea that it's people making images and objects and films and experiences with the hope that, they help us kind of position ourselves and reflect and work through this weird world. So alongside that conception of contemporary art, I would like to add my own, which is contemporary alarm. And this is this idea that we can use sound as a way to better understand and to better interact with the world and the world's urgencies. And I use the term alarm, of course, because of its history of sound, but that begs the question, what's alarming? And that little microphone feedback is alarming, but it's actually kind of relevant to the talk. So we're going to go with it. But when I think about what's alarming in the biggest imaginable picture, it's what is of deep and grave concern to us all, whether or not we want it. And that, to me, seems like it has to be global warming, the climate crisis, 60 degrees in February in New York City. And so I would like to suggest that we hear white noise as an alarm that's directing us to think about global warming. And at its most basic, white noise is this. It's static, visual or audio. It's pure randomness. But white noise is also the sound of air conditioning units. It's the sound of cars. It's the sound that you hear inside a plane when you're on a flight for several hours. In a way, it's the sound of kind of industrial living. And I would like to think that everyone who lives and exposes themselves to that particular type of white noise, while no individual is going to be the cause of global warming, if you hear those sounds all the time, as I do, as you do, it means that you're in a position of relative privilege to bring up ideas, to contour the discussion, to effectively work towards the communities that can make a change and have an impact in those zones. And I like this idea that the contemporary alarm is going to be constant. It's going to be a completely different type of time scale than your alarm clock in the morning or the siren that passes by in the fire truck that says, "Hey, you, act now." This is a different type of alarm. It says, "Hey, you, act." Act and continue acting. Act as a way of moving through life. And also, most alarms are sort of top-down, especially most of the widespread state alarms. It's going to be the military or the cops or something. This idea that how we're transforming the environment, those types of sounds are very widely distributed. So if you're within earshot, you're being urged to act. And another type of white noise I would like to say should be considered alarming is this type of white noise. This is a Marpac white noise machine. It was invented in 1962 as a sleep aid. And so the idea here is that it's a little fan. It puts out this sort of white noise that masks all your other sound and allows you to have a better night's sleep. But with the rise of psychotherapy in America in the 70s, these machines very quickly became used within doctors' offices, inside and outside of the rooms. And there, instead of a sleep aid, the idea was that they were there to sort of silence your words, to make your speech to your doctor completely private. And so there we have, the kind of the birth of the neoliberal self, the I sort of separate from the traditional family and social ties, who's recounting their important personal problems in a way that must be protected and sheltered, which is all fair and good, but there is this sense that those type of hyper-personal, hyper-protected personal stories aren't where the sort of contemporary urgencies lie. And so this type of masking, what would it mean to take a step back from that as well? And maybe focusing on listening and not talking, maybe focus on one individual story, less as this is my own, I must fight for it, and more of I am participating in a chorus. There are going to be other very similar stories. What happens if we start to think of ways in which these can align? And the last type of white noise I would like to include in the contemporary alarm is it offers a different view. And this is white noise as pleasure. And to talk about that, we need to go to pop music. Specifically, we need to go to Japan in 1980 when this thing was invented, the Roland TR-808. So the kind of brilliant engineer who came up with this idea, he said, we're going to make a drum machine, and it's not going to try and sound like sort of realistic. However, he realized that if you take, white noise is sort of painful if you just listen to it loud. But if you take tiny homeopathic doses of it, it can create very nice and musically pleasurable sounds of snares and hi-hats and so on. So, we have a pause. We wait a moment. And here I have this set up so that if you look here in the corner, there's a little oscilloscope, which is going to show you the waveform. This is just an example of our friend white noise. Sort of dull. But what happens if you start taking little tiny snippets of it, and so that's what they did with the Roland TR-808. But the incredible story behind that is that as this engineer made this realization, he's like, you can use little analog transistors, amplify them, and make these incredible sounds. He started realizing that each transistor would sound a little bit different. So he just listened to dozens and dozens and dozens of these transistors. And eventually he found that the best sounding one were actually rejects. They couldn't be used for the TV or radio purpose, but they made the most brilliant sounds that, when cut up like that, were wonderful. And so he said, okay, I've got this box. There are 12,000 transistors in it. I'm going to build a drum machine using each one will have one of these. I'll make 12,000 units. When they run out, we stop. And so that went on to become the legendary 808. And almost every pop song is going to have a sound from the 808 in it. Kanye West's 808s and Heartbreak, famously, but Marvin Gaye, Sexual Healing, endless. It really sort of took off in this incredible way. And I like this use of white noise because, for two reasons. One, it's a reminder that in the digital domain, there's no such thing as true randomness. Computers can't generate random numbers. They can only compute. They can make pseudo-random numbers, but to get a truly wild guess, you need to be analog. You need to be in the sort of chaotic natural world. And so that was why he turned to amplifying these bizarre bits of equipment to make that analog noise. And the ear could hear the difference. But also important, one of the things that the TR-808 did was standardize the beat. So in the 80s, in the 70s, with disco and house and all of these, you had for the first time humans dancing to a hyper-machinic metronome of a beat, totally regular. But as it turned out, people were using these bits of white noise, the snare and the hi-hat, to mark the moments of swing, to mark the offbeat, to mark the moments of flow that would encourage dancers to kind of go against that grid. They said, okay, this is here, this is the hyper-regular music, but there's always these sort of sinuous curves within that we can take, and let's focus in on that. So that's kind of my view on thinking about this white noise as contemporary alarm. On the one hand, with the sound of air conditioners, there's this call to say, having your own sort of private, interior, personalized, climate-controlled space, that's not really sustainable. What would it mean to move towards more porous places, into a messier public sphere? What would it mean if we all have to sweat together? And the white noise of the white noise machines, to me, that's saying that, yes, the individual narrative, the heroic narrative, the artist, the genius, the president, that's useful, but it's of a limited use. And once again, what would it mean if we are to think about different ways to combine these various individual stories into something more like a chorus? And of course, the white noise of the drum machine, that's always this reminder that no matter how loud and overpowering and just sort of intolerable the wall can be, there's always going to be moments to find that not quite human, but human-machine hybrid slipperiness within there, that there's always going to be ways to find that space in which to act. And so another thing about white noise is that it's, oh, they're there again. Yes, the internet likes cats, the internet likes 808s. It's this very mythic machine. So here we are with white noise again. And you could say that the sound of white noise, it's the most complicated waveform there is because it's effectively pure chaos, pure randomness, no pattern whatsoever. And in contrast, I'd like to move to a discussion of bass. And I say bass in trap music because trap music loves sine wave bass. And this, you'll see, is a sine wave, and if white noise is the most complicated waveform that we know of, this is the simplest. That's the second most simple. And the kind of wonderful thing about, we're going to geek out a little bit, sine waves, they're no curve, there's only curve. It's pure frequency, AKA pure pitch. There's no bumps or jagged edges in the waveform that would give it harmonics, that would give it something we think of as texture. And I'm going to do a little sweep of a sine wave. It's very, here we go. This is what it sounds like. Nice and simple, nice and pure. And I was saying that trap producers love this, and it's interesting because if you're thinking about bass and dance music, people are hyper obsessed with bass and making crazy bass louder, and that usually means that they don't deal with sine waves because they're so sort of vanilla, because they're so pure. But one of the things that trap producers realize and exploit is that in terms of the sheer ability to move air and have that air move bodies and move buildings and move walls, anything that bass can do, sine wave bass can do better, precisely because it's so sort of basic and direct. So a few examples of that is, well, oops, let me switch again. oh no, is Cardi B's tapped into it with the title of her album, Invasion of Privacy. So sound is one of the main ways in which we sort of understand the division between public space and private space. So here in New York, if you're in your apartment, but you hear like the thump, thump, thump of your neighbor's techno or something, chances are you're going to feel like your space is being invaded. And one of the reason for that is because sound waves, a high-pitched wave, or like my voice, for example, it's going to be maybe an inch from peak to peak of that wave. Whereas a very low bass wave, it's going to be dozens of feet long. And in order to make the low end, you need a lot of more power than to make a high sound. And that means that whereas the high frequencies, they get stopped by apartment walls, by car windows, by material and bodies, bass waves can often pass right through them. And so bass seeps into your building and kind of disturbs your sense of peace or your sense of isolation. And another thing that bass does is it loves to make things resonate. Of course, everything in the universe has a frequency at which it resonates and moves. But because the bass waves tend to be more powerful, you often get these incredible responses. You could hear it a little bit in these speakers when they started to sort of distort when it went down low. Those speakers started to shake at the same frequency. And this means that with the right bass frequencies, they're literally able to reproduce themselves in other objects. Sometimes you'll feel it in the club, but your belly starts shaking when the sub bass comes in. That's resonance happening. And another interesting thing about bass, the sort of sonics of it all, is that we have two ears, we hear in stereo. And the way that works is, our brains we're kind of like bats, actually. It's a little bit of echolocation. Like you hear a noise, and the sound wave reaches your ears with a split second of difference. And we interpret that difference to figure out direction, where something's coming from. But with bass frequencies, because the waves are so long, you actually can't orient yourself, and we are incapable of telling what direction that it's coming from. So bass is experienced as pure presence. You can feel it, you can react to it, you can even call out the pitch, but you can't even precisely tell where it's from. It's sort of living in you. And let's see. Here we go. I'll play the beginning of Cardi B's Bodak Yellow. And listen to the bass. And I'm choosing this song. Of course, it's a mega hit. She's an icon. But the bass does weird things in this track, very weird things, and they're sort of under-commented. So I'd like to talk about them.
These expensive, these is red bottoms, these is blood shoes. Hit the store, I can get them both. I don't want to choose, and I'm quick, cut a nigga off, so don't get comfortable. Look, I don't dance now, I make money move. Say I don't gotta dance, I make money move. If I see you now speak, that means I don't fuck with you. I'm a boss, you a record bitch, I make bloody moves. Now she say she gon' do what a hoop. Let's find out and see. Cardi B, you know where I'm at, you know where I be. You in the club, since you party, I'm there, I get paid a fee. I be in and out them days so much, I know they tired of me. Honestly, don't give a fuck about who in front of me. Try to make 6 in 6 months, one bitch working as hard as me. I don't bother with these hoes, don't let these hoes bother me. They see pictures, they say ghosts, bitch I'm who they trying to be. Look.
So you kind of really don't hear so much of the bass, which is to say it's misbehaving. Usually in a dance track and a rap track, the bass is going to be supporting the melody or accentuating the rhythm. This is not doing any of those things. And I'm sure you've walked by someone listening to this music on their phone or on their headphones, you'll hear the voice of the rapper, very important. You'll hear the hi-hats marking time and swing as they do, those little bursts of white noise. But the bass is totally gone. Same thing with laptop speakers. Because you need a lot of power to make these tones, it means that Jay White, who produced this, and countless of other people making this trap sound, they're focusing in on, they said, hey, we're going to use these sine waves, which are both very powerful, but also can be hard to hear for all these various reasons. And so that begs the question, what does it mean to craft a sound made to disappear and appear? Not only is the bass functioning in an odd way in the sound, in the song, half the time when you're hearing Bodak Yellow, you can't hear the bass anyhow. But if you're in a club or if you're in a car and it comes on, boom, this one bass tone every 11 seconds, that might be massive and change your whole perspective. And so to me, this is a moment, well, first off, bass is fundamentally unruly. But what with trap focuses this basic acoustic fact into social commentary precisely by making the interplay between amplification and silence part of its overall thematic. More specifically, trap is a sort of subgenre of rap, which out of all the different styles of rap, it's the one that's gone worldwide the quickest. But one of the things that's interesting about trap music is that there's only one rule lyrically, and that's you have to rap about breaking the rules. It's this fundamentally, it's a music which lyrically it's very engaged in this idea of a contentious public space. It's like we're out there, we're on the streets, a trap is a house where drugs are sold, and that idea that you must transgress, it's embedded in it lyrically. But I'm so interested because with the production, these underdog sonics, they too are making a very complex statement about power and visibility and presence in America. So trap manages to articulate this. It makes audible the ways in which blackness is, if nothing else, a mix of hypervisibility and invisibility, a seemingly permanent conflict with the ruling order. And it highlights those flows, and half the time it's not even there. And specifically, trap producers hone in on the sine wave because these are the frequencies that can best antagonize public space, that can best shake it up. And there's another aspect of bass quickly, is that in studios where music gets quote unquote mastered, in professional studios where they sort of tame and professionalize the music, they're filled with these foam things you see in the corners. And these are called bass traps. And because of all the weird psychoacoustics of bass, they seep through walls, they bounce back off walls, and double their own sound by reflecting. All these strange things happens. There's this entire industry of foam content management and control built around bass. It's kind of beautiful, but it's also kind of fascinating because we all know that what bass and bottom and ass is, it's always edged with a corporeal. But acoustics are inseparable from blackness if we understand blackness as the condition of being in and out of societal order. And this is what trap and the prison industrial complex and bass acoustics all tell us that it's about. A few songs later in Cardi B's album, this is a joke from Instagram, which feels resonant and sort of dissonant, because a few songs later, she adds a twist to this dialectic, and she says, I like niggas who've been in and out of jail. So a sentence I love. And on the first reading of that, you're like, okay, she's acknowledging that oscillating between freedom and confinement against your will is part of what defines whatever it is a nigga might be. And she's saying that those who are subject to that subjection deserve love, which is wonderful. But zooming out a bit, I think to me this sentence refers to the fact that anybody who's sort of manifesting themselves, their simple presence in public space, who causes issue with the ruling powers, whether it's because of gender identity or religious identity, the color of your skin, anyone who's subject to those sort of like most harsh manifestations of state or medical control, those people deserve to be loved and protected because there's this sense that it's precisely those people who are helping the wider society call into question all these different categories of categorization. And so I'm hearing this trap bass as a kind of sonic manifestation of Cardi B saying this love for niggas who've been in and out of jail. And then I started thinking, well, if that's a sonic manifestation, what's the visual manifestation? And does anybody recognize this? So this is someone in the back. You need to shout. Oh, yeah. It's Rikers, right? And you can see it when you leave flyover LaGuardia because you look out the window and it's right there. It's just a couple yards from the Bronx, a couple yards from Queens. And I feel like, and at any given point, there's roughly 20,000 people on it, the island, between 10 and 15,000 of them inmates who haven't been charged with anything. But this idea of manifesting, the visual manifestation of trap bass is this. It's the New York City subway map. And I realized in 2015, they changed the map and they put Rikers Island on it. In the previous map, 2007, Rikers was unmentioned. But on it goes. The maps, throughout this long 100-year history of maps of New York City, since the 30s when Riker began, almost every time the New York City subway map changes, Rikers is either named or unnamed. Sometimes you'll see the island with no name, sometimes it's there. It's a wild mix. And lots of changes happened in the 60s and 70s because the maps were redesigned every few years. And to me, this is a sort of flip side of this bass music that kind of comes from the community subjected to it. This is the institutional version. And this version, to me, it's asking us to think about the relationship between visibility and power, of course. Like, can you critique a space or a thing if you can't visualize it? What does it mean to sort of isolate something which is actually entirely integral to how the city works, to how the state works? What does it mean if we start thinking of moments like these as somehow central, despite what the maps might want to be telling us? And maybe you all recognize it was Rikers, but even the fact that there's an island among these many islands that we pass by every day that we don't see, this is this very, on the surface, institutional ambivalence, institutional hostility, institutional irrationality to its own functioning as an institution, as a place that locks people up. And so somehow bass brought us there. So via white noise, we've had the hi-hats. That's a sine wave just sort of put through a little ping filter. So with this sine wave bass, we have a kind of bass line or a kick drum. So the thing that we need now is a synthesizer line, and then we'll have a song, and then the lecture will be a song. So to sort of wrap up, I'm going to touch on acid house for a little bit. Acid house, a genre of dance music, boomed in the 80s in England with this smiley face iconography, cheap MDMA and ecstasy, but more specific, this very alien, very futuristic music that was pioneered by these guys, Future, P-H-U-T-R-E, in Chicago. And so they made the very first acid house track called Acid Tracks in 1985. And it was one of those moments where a music genre appears all of a sudden, and the first song that establishes it, it becomes the sort of pinnacle of the genre, and everyone else is just doing endless iterations. So the Daft Punks and the Fatboy Slims and the Richie Haughtons of the world, they're kind of all following in the footsteps of what Future pioneered. And it was Future and another Roland product. This time the TB-303, a cheap little bass synthesizer that had a very strange filter with a very strange resonance function. But before I play this song, I would like to mention that 1985 was also the year that Willem Flusser published Into the Universe of Technical Images. And it was just a few years before Ursula Franklin published her book, The Real World of Technology. And they are both Holocaust survivors, very different writers. Ursula Franklin began in Germany and ended up in Toronto, and Willem Flusser began in Prague and ended up in Brazil. But while most of these thoughts that I've been sharing with you, these thoughts and connections, have come from dancing to music, listening to music, and making music, these two writers and those two books have certainly sort of contoured and assisted my thinking around some of these other aspects. So I wanted to give them a shout out before we listen to Future. So that song continues for another 12 minutes. And it's kind of all the same, and it's kind of all transcendent with these subtle modulations, which make it amazing. But briefly, I have to say that the original version that they recorded live one night, because in order to make it make those sounds, you needed to be hands-on with the machine, they brought to the guy on the right, Ron Hardy, and they played it for him, and he just sat there listening for the half hour. And they were scared. They're like, oh no, we were like bugged out making this crazy alien music, and we're bringing it to like the sort of most open-minded and adventuresome and influential DJ in Chicago, and he's silent. But at the end of the half hour, Ron Hardy turns to them and says, when can I get a copy? As soon as he gets a copy, he takes it to the club and he plays it, and he clears the dance floor. But he knows that, he knows that this is visionary and this is unprecedented and this is sort of a beautifully strange moment. So later in the night, he plays it again, and like a few people stay, but mostly people, he clears the dance floor, and he's like, screw it. He plays it a third time, and finally he's like, okay, it's a lukewarm reaction, as if this was a bad song. He lets the club night keep going, people get a little bit looser, a little bit more wild, and he finally plays it for a fourth time, and then finally the crowd's like, okay, we give in, and the alien spaceship has landed, like, we're gonna dance. And then it went there and spread to UK, spread into all sorts of avenues of mainstream music. But I want to talk about the boring stuff. I want to talk about this, which is to say that weird liquidy sound, it's achieved by the filter built into the 303, and it's a resonant low-pass filter. And so the image on the left is a regular low-pass filter. And a regular low-pass filter, basically, as you turn the knob, it slowly cancels out all the high-pitched frequencies on down to silence. So you see the hump. So just take something loud and bright and slowly make it less bright, then slowly muffle it, and then it's gone. However, with a resonant high-pass feature, it has this technical quirk built into it, which is that the cutoff frequency, the frequency above which everything is muted, at that point, there's also a boost, and you see that in the little hump on the right side. And that boost introduces strange new wave shapes, strange new harmonics, and it's a very kind of subtle detail, but the sonic implications of it can be quite broad. And I'm gonna give you an example of a sweep, and you can hear it. I'm gonna do it first once without resonance, and then I'll do it again with resonance, so you can sort of hear it in slow motion. And here, there's a little oscilloscope. That's what I'm talking about. Here, there's a little oscilloscope. It's very confusing. I'm in virtual space here. It's odd. I feel like Malcolm Gladwell or Omar Berrada. Ugh. Anyhow, I filter sleep with no resonance. And now I'm going to do it again, but adding resonance, which is the type of thing that was built into the 303, whose creative misuse led to the sound called acid house. So it has this entirely different character. And that character is achieved because what that point, that little bump of resonance is, that's kind of pushing the machine almost on the verge of feedback. It's taking the signal and injecting it back into the apparatus. And it means that the filter response, instead of being linear and predictable, it becomes chaotic and unruly. And so the smallest change can make it do these weird spikes. And feedback, like the microphone feedback at the beginning before they took out those frequencies, that can be piercing, it can damage your ears. If it goes loud enough, it can break a sound system. And I'm just gonna play around with, I'm gonna bring back the white noise, and I'm gonna bring back that sine wave that I'm cutting on and off so it makes a kick, and I'm gonna play around a little bit with the resonance to get into it. I think, hold on, let's get back to the screen. And I'm like, on the way over here, I'm like, why am I playing them acid house and telling them about filters? And I think I know why. And it actually has to do with a couple things. And one of them is that there is, to me, a kind of beauty in the human-machine interaction that's happening here. You know, part of it is this play of absence and presence, like I was discussing in trap bass, but more of it, I understand it as it's this moment, the moment of feedback is the moment where control threatens to become its opposite. And it's a moment where these very tiny aesthetic and very tiny technical decisions can actually have a huge and enormous repercussions. And in the case of this music, you might say, oh, it's just this weird sound and forget about it. But instead, that was enough to catapult that particular sound into the name of a whole genre that took over. And that idea of being able to have, you know, we're in the machine, we know this, but to be able to have that sort of tactile, hands-on control, I can listen and adjust. If I let go, it might turn into a screaming, screeching ear bleed of a mess, but if I'm monitoring it and there's this give and take, then something incredible and even beautiful can be achieved. And I think I'm also thinking about resonance and feedback because we're living in what Shoshana Zuboff calls the age of surveillance capitalism, right? So effectively the dominant form of feedback that we're participating in every day is the type of feedback that happens when you go online and buy something or look at some images or start to write something on Facebook and then pause and then delete it. All of those gestures, all of those microtransactions are noted and logged and used as examples of human-machine interaction that provide very economically valuable feedback, but always in the service of increased control. You know, and this idea, it's kind of an evil feedback loop. They're like, yeah, there's enormous amounts of aggregate data sets, crazy data sets, and it, in fact, is helpful in letting, for example, letting them know which ad should I best serve this person to convince them to vote for candidate X versus candidate Y, or, it goes deep. And it's not even only in online digital spaces. There's been a lot of talk lately in the news of what's going on in China with the Muslim Uyghur population, where it's all about public cameras, face surveillance, face recognition technology. So we're in the middle of this deep and troubling web of human-machine feedback interaction, which feels so far removed from our fingertips, so far removed from any notion of sort of community joy. And I think that has me going back to Acid House. And while any history of electronic music can be written as the history of creative misuse of the tools, in the case of Acid House, it's the 303. I think this is an interesting example for thinking about how anything comes into being, which is to say, yes, you needed Future, those guys, and you needed the 303. But in order for it all to come together, you needed, Tadao Kikimoto, the Japanese engineer who built the 303. And you needed Ron Hardy. And more broadly, you needed the community of gay, black, Midwestern ravers who were really open-minded and wanted the new, and didn't reject that strange song, but instead kept dancing to it and propelled it. And you even needed all the sort of conservative, boring, humanist bass players who didn't buy the TB303 that was marketed to them. They were marketing it as like replace your bassist, and none of them bought it. And because of that, it was really cheap. And because it was really cheap, kids in the hood were able to buy it and then start doing all these weird things. And so again, this is, I'm putting aside the white noise machine and thinking of a sort of choral narrative of this change. And I'm gravitating towards these spaces where it's certainly a strange assemblage that can link inexpensive MDMA in the British countryside and I'm still not in the, whoops. And the technicians, and the ravers, and all these people, maybe disparate in space and time, and yet it's happening. And in this case, it's a moment where a tiny aesthetic technological shift explodes into a whole kind of cultural movement. And I also come back to Acid House to think of, this is Harvey Bell. Like me, he's from Worcester, Massachusetts. And I also, I'm sort of on this communitarian thing, but there's something we need to protect the Harvey Bells too. He made the happy face smiley logo and was paid $45. End of story. And his face says it all. So, yeah, I think that's a good as place of any to stop. And thank you for your attention.